Then you have an emphasis on suffering, that everybody has to suffer, not just the Son of Man, but everybody has to suffer. And you have a prediction of future eschatological glory. Eschatology is just a fancy theological word meaning the end times, the study of the end times. Eschaton is just a Greek word meaning the end. You'll see this if you read much about the Bible or ancient religion. The eschaton will come up in apocalyptic context, and eschatology means any study or doctrine about the end of the world as we know it. In fact, I used to direct a little singing group in the divinity school when I was a grad student here, and we called ourselves the Eschatones. A joke that only divinity students would get. So the prediction of the eschatological glory that comes after the suffering, and then right after that, 6:2, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, led them up to a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And they appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter says to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, 3 tabernacles, 3 tents. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with him anymore, but only Jesus. The next verse, "And they were coming down the mountain. As they were coming, he ordered them to tell no one what they had seen." Again, that secrecy motif, "until the Son of Man had risen from the dead." And again, an emphasis on death. What's going on with all this? What's going on is that Mark is trying to make an important point, maybe even to his fellow believers at the time. Apparently, what Peter doesn't understand about Jesus is that Jesus has to suffer and has to die. And if that causes a redefinition of Peter's notion of what a Messiah is, so be it. Peter needs to work with a redefined notion of the Christ, the Messiah, if he doesn't include the necessity of suffering in that notion. Let's imagine the context for this kind of message. The rapid fire style of Mark is one of the, if you notice, did you notice how many times immediately is used, the word immediately? The writer of the Gospel of Mark needed a good Yale College editor or a writing tutor, because it's kind of a rapid fire. It's not written in very good Greek style either. It's rapid fire. He says, immediately this happened, then immediately this happened, then immediately this happened. You get the idea reading the Gospel of Mark that the narrative is pulling you along, is shoving you along, is rushing you along. That's actually part of, I think, this apocalyptic style of Mark, because the Gospel of Mark is also apocalyptic in its message. It talks about angels coming at the end. It talks about a big war that's going to happen. So you have demons and the battle of Jesus with the strong man, another apocalyptic story. You have the emphasis on suffering and persecution, and that's a common theme of Jewish apocalyptic. Not that the Messiah would suffer, but that the Jews themselves might have to suffer before the fabulous kingdom of the end time. Remember, you saw it in Daniel when we read Daniel 2 classes ago. Daniel predicts suffering for the righteous, and only after the suffering would you have the goodies, heaven, the kingdom of God. Now we'll look at Mark 13, and we're going to analyze it pretty carefully, because, again, some of these things will come into play. The basic message I'm saying is that people misunderstand about Jesus is they misunderstand the necessity of suffering that must be there before you, it must precede glory. Yes, God promises them glory. They're going to be glorified in the end. They're going to win in the end. But they have to go through a period of suffering. Jesus is the first one who does this. He accepts suffering and death before he himself is glorified, but the glory will come. It has to be preceded by suffering. But Jesus also in Mark tells the disciples over and over again, you also will have to suffer first, but if you endure, you will experience glory also. Look at Mark 13. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." And Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." So he's predicting the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray." So false prophets Jesus predicts there'll be false prophets, maybe even false messiahs, although he doesn't use that term here in Mark. It will occur in other places. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. So just when times are bad and there are wars, that's not necessarily the end yet. You've got to have fear of those. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, famines, but it is the beginning of the birth pangs. As for yourself, beware, for they will hand you over to councils. You will be beaten in synagogues. Again, this theme of suffering. So you have all these terrible cosmic events, terrible wars and disasters, earthquakes and all that sort of thing. But also, he says, you're going to have to suffer. They're going to hand you over for persecution. In 13:10, and the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. So Jesus is predicting that before the end comes, his message, the gospel message, will be proclaimed all around. And even though you have worse things happening, 13:12, brother will betray brother to death, a father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. In other words, familial divisions even. The households will be torn apart by the suffering, by the conflict. And then 13:14, but when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, now here's one of those little phrases, let the reader understand. The author is giving you a very, very clear clue that this is when you really better be paying attention. Let the reader understand. When you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be. Have we heard that before? The abomination of desolation is the King James English translation of it. The desolating sacrilege is often what's translated in more modern Bibles. It all refers to the same language. Where have we heard about the abomination of desolation being set up where it ought not to be set up before? Daniel. The words come right out of Daniel. They occur of course, Daniel was written in a combination of Hebrew and Aramaic, and this is in Greek, but this is the Greek translation. You have it in Daniel 9:27, Daniel 11:31, and Daniel 12:11. So this Jesus has read his Daniel. And then you have warnings and woes, verses 15 through 13. So you have all this stuff. But now, what happens after that? The one who on the housetop must not go down into the house to take anything away. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not be in winter, for in those days there will be suffering, such as not been from the beginning of creation, that God and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would be saved. Now notice, we're not getting any more historical events here. We're not getting any more stuff happening, except right then he says, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or look, there he is, do not believe it. False messiahs, false prophets, so there's more false messiahs than false prophets. In those days after that suffering, now here's where you really get the cataclysmic end, the world crashing down. The sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. Stars will fall from the skies. The powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then you will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great glory and power. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. When does it happen? Right after the abomination of desolation is set up where it ought not to be. What is the abomination of desolation? Well, we don't know. Obviously, if Jesus is reading Daniel, and this is where it's getting this, he also believes that something's going to happen in the temple. The author Daniel believed it was something that Antiochus IV Epiphanes maybe sacrificed a pig on the altar, or he desecrated somehow the altar and the Holy of Holies in the temple. Jesus doesn't believe that that event was the end event, as Daniel thought it was. Jesus is predicting that this is going to happen. Something's going to happen in the temple that's going to be so awful, and it's going to be an abomination. And once that happens, then all hell breaks loose. And when all hell is broken loose the worse, then the Son of Man will swoop down in the clouds with angels and put a stop to it all. That'll be the glorification. So when does this happen? Well, Mark has told us one thing. It's going to happen during your own generation. Jesus has said, this generation will not pass away before this stuff happens. The apostles asked him. So he said, well, it will be within a generation. Then he says, now nobody's going to know the exact time, but once you see the abomination of desolation set up in the temple where it ought not to be, that's when it's going to happen. Now, did this happen? Well, we're not narrated anything about it. What does Mark not narrate in this section that we as historians know happened with the temple? What? What does he not narrate happening? It's destruction. Jesus predicts the destruction. Jesus prophesies about destruction. But Mark doesn't tell us that the temple in Jerusalem are destroyed. He doesn't tell us explicitly about the Roman armies led by Vespasian and Titus surrounding Jerusalem and besieging it for 2 years. He doesn't tell us that in the year 70, the Romans actually did take Jerusalem and burn the temple, destroy the temple. If Mark knew about that, why didn't he tell us about it? This is why a lot of scholars believe this is exactly like Daniel. Remember how we said, how do you date Daniel? You figure out when has his history gone right, and when does his history not go right anymore? And if you applied that same standard of test to this text, what you've got is a prediction of the temple destruction, so at least the writer knows that it is likely to happen. He can see it happening in the future, but he doesn't narrate it happening. Yes, sir?
I just wanted to comment on the version I have has generation translated also as race.
Yes. Conservative Christians know that more than one generation has happened since that time, many, many, many generations. They've taken the Greek word translated here as generation, which I think is the right translation, and they say, well, if you can take that to mean race of people. And of course, what race would they then be referring to? The Jews. And so conservative Christians who believe this has to be an accurate prediction of something that's going to happen in our future also translate that as race, or say the generation doesn't refer to a generation of time of 40 years or so. It means the race of the Jews. As long as there are Jews in existence, then this thing can still go on and hasn't happened yet. So that explains the translation. Quite frankly, I think the translation is just wrong. Because it seems to me that what Mark's intention is to put some kind of time limit on this. He's trying to get his readers to see a time. Well, if you just say the race of the Jews, then that doesn't give you any sense of time.